In the midst of the blizzard, the sky felt torn apart by something invisible. The snow fell so thick, it seemed to bury not just the forest, but an entire memory. Then, a broken whinny echoed through the void. No one knew where it came from. Inside a decaying cabin deep in the woods, a man, who had buried himself in darkness for over 15 years, suddenly opened the door. And in that moment, it wasn't the wind, it wasn't the snow, but fate stepped in. A dying foal on the edge. A man who thought he had died inside. And a meeting, so haunting that even nature held its breath. What you're about to witness isn't just a rescue, but the final miracle of life, sent to hearts that have long lost faith and hope. Will this man find the courage to face the pain he's buried for so long, or will the darkness consume him? Join us on this journey, where every step is a step closer to the miracle that fate has been waiting to unfold. Not everyone who breathes is alive, some merely exist, trapped in silence and memory. Elias Grant was one of those souls. In the heart of the high pines, a jagged, wind-scoured mountain range frozen nearly all year round, stood a small wooden cabin perched on the edge of a forgotten valley. No one came near it. No one dared to ask. And most had already forgotten the man who once gave hope to creatures that couldn't speak. Elias Grant, once the most renowned veterinarian in the Ash Lake region, had vanished, as if buried alive in the weight of his own past. They said he once had a beautiful family, a gentle wife named May, and a boy who followed him like a shadow. But on a brutal winter night 15 years ago, a car accident took them both. That storm didn't just steal his wife and son, it froze the very core of his soul. From that moment on, Elias never healed another life. He no longer needed healing himself. He left the town, climbed into the mountains, and never looked back. Each morning, Elias woke early. He stoked the fire, brewed strong black tea, and stared out at a sky perpetually gray through a window glazed with frost. Winter days felt endless, like sorrow with no shore. In his late 40s, Elias looked well past 70, hair graying like ash, eyes sunken deep, and a beard like tangled silver vines. He spoke to the wind, to the fire, to the shadow of himself cast on the wooden wall, but never to another human soul. In winter, the high pines became another world, a realm that rejected mankind. Winds howled like wolves on the hunt. Snow buried every trail, and silence became the only language spoken. Elias survived on stale bread, home-smoked meat, and dusty books on animal anatomy. His life drifted forward like a frozen stream, unbending, quiet, and utterly alone. He might have stayed that way until the end. But then came that night. It was December. No warning. The sky collapsed in a storm so savage, it roared like the earth itself was being torn apart. Wind shrieked through the trees, rattled roofs, and strangled every breath. Elias had seen many winters. But this one felt different. He braced the door, piled logs on the fire, filled his kettle, and settled into the shadowed silence. The walls trembled. Snow slipped in through the cracks. The chill seeped into his bones like memories he had long buried. And then, a sound ripped through the storm. A whinny. Soft. Fractured. Distant. Elias froze. He thought his mind was playing tricks. But there it was again. Like a single broken note lost in a violent symphony of wind. Not a wolf. Not a tree groaning. It was a foal's cry. Faint. Halting. As if it had traveled through entire worlds just to reach his ears. Elias stood. His heart pounded, for the first time in years. He grabbed his old fur coat, pulled the lid tight, lit the oil lamp, and slung a small rifle over his shoulder. He didn't think. He simply moved. Stepping into the storm was like walking into the mouth of a living beast. Snow swallowed his boots. The wind tore at his eyes. But he kept going. Eyes scanning, searching for a flicker in the white, like a fallen star buried in the snow. Cold. Brutal cold. The kind of cold that clawed up through memories. Memories of the last time he had run out into a night like this, and returned with 2 frozen bodies in his arms. But tonight, something deeper pushed him forward. A whisper inside that something needed saving. He walked nearly 30 minutes. The oil lamp flickered. Wind lashed his face. Snow clung to him like unseen hands. Then, he saw it. A small black shape, slumped beneath a broken pine. He dropped to his knees. The lamp's glow illuminated a tiny form. A foal, no more than a few weeks old. Its coat drenched, trembling. Breath shallow. Eyes barely open. Each exhale a whisper of steam, like a soul slowly slipping from its body. No mare. No tracks. No herd nearby. Just the cold. And the creeping shadow of death. Elias didn't know why the tears came. But they came. A man who hadn't cried in 15 years now knelt in the snow, cradling the fragile, shivering body of a dying foal. And with a voice that cracked like the firewood in his hearth, he whispered, "Not tonight, little one. Not tonight." The words barely left Elias's lips as he clutched the tiny foal against his chest. Snow kept falling, thick, drifting flakes swirling in the flickering glow of his lantern. As if the sky were breathing out the last cold breaths of a world long forgotten. Branwin, though still unnamed, though not yet known, had already wrapped herself around the last fragile thread still pulsing in the frozen heart of a broken man. Elias couldn't recall how he made it back to the cabin. He only remembered the fire in his calves, the ache in his shoulders from carrying that fading life. Every step he took was a silent vow that he would not let this one die. Not again. Not this time. When the wooden door burst open, the wind came with it, throwing a sheet of snow across the floor. Elias nearly collapsed. He laid the foal gently on an old woolen rug in front of the fireplace. His hands trembled as he lit the fire. The dry logs hissed and smoked, reluctant at first, then the first flames bloomed, like a miracle. In the golden light dancing across the dusty cabin walls, Elias could see the foal's body clearly. Dirty. Frozen. Shivering. Its chest rose and fell in uneven, desperate rhythms, like every breath was a battle. Elias grabbed a dry cloth and warm water, wiping the packed snow from its legs, its back, its belly. Each touch felt like reaching into some forgotten memory. Soft, vulnerable, something he once held, and had long since lost. He sighed and gently draped an old blanket over its body. The fire crackled higher. The room grew warmer. And for the first time in years, so did something inside him. Elias filled a small wooden spoon with warm water and brought it to the foal's lips. No response. Then, a twitch. Its right ear flicked ever so slightly. Elias's breath caught. He leaned closer, eyes locked on the foal's face, its eyes now half open, foggy and distant, but shimmering faintly with a soft gray-brown hue, like morning mist at the edge of winter. No fear. No pain. Only one thing, quiet trust. Branwin. The name came to him like a voice carried across lifetimes. Branwin, he whispered. A name from an old Celtic legend, a spirit of winter, said to bring light to frozen places. Elias said it again, firmer this time, as if naming her gave her strength. Branwin. That's your name. That night, Elias never left her side. He rotated towels, massaged her spine, murmured stories into the silence. Stories he hadn't told anyone since the day his world ended. My wife. May, she loved the snow, but hated the sound of the wind howling. Danny, Our boy used to dream of having a little horse. Said he'd name it Clover, 'cause clovers meant luck. I've saved hundreds of horses in my life, but I never thought one would be the one to save me. The night crawled by. Snow stopped falling around 3 in the morning. The sky outside looked like a thick wool blanket, dark, heavy, unbroken. Branwin's breathing grew steadier. Her chest no longer spasmed. Her back slowly warmed. Her eyelids fluttered, as if she were drifting into her very first dream. Elias ran his fingers along the soft fur on her neck. And then he saw it. A faint spiral-shaped scar just above her left hind leg. He frowned. As a veterinarian, Elias had seen every kind of scar. The ones from fences, fights, or careless humans. But this wasn't any of those. This scar wasn't natural. It was deliberate. A symbol. A mark meant never to be forgotten. He grabbed the oil lamp and angled the light toward it. Gently, he traced the spiral with his fingertips. It was barely visible, but there. Soft, sure, ancient. "What are you, little one?" he whispered, not really expecting an answer. Outside, the sky began to pale. Elias stood slowly, stretched his aching back, poured himself another cup of tea. He sipped in silence, watching Branwin, now fast asleep, swaddled in wool, glowing in the warm light of the fire. And he knew nothing would ever be the same again. I'm not sure if I just saved a foal, or if she just saved me from the quiet death I'd been living every day. And I didn't yet know that the name Branwin would one day be carved into stone, etched into memory, and woven into a legend I never believed was real. I don't know if I saved a horse that night, or if she saved me from the quiet death I'd been dying every single day. Those words still echoed in Elias's mind, even as the first light of dawn struggled to pierce the fogged glass of his cabin window. He remained by the fire, now fading, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea, his eyes never leaving the small figure curled beneath the old wool blanket. Branwin was still alive. It was the first miracle Elias had dared to believe in for many years. By morning, the cabin felt like a different world. The fire no longer raged, but glowed softly. Smoke, tea, and the faint scent of damp horsehair lingered in the air, strangely familiar, strangely comforting. Elias returned to Branwin's side. He changed her towels, gently stroked her neck, checked her pulse. Still weak, but steady. Her chest rose and fell with a slow rhythm, like the first notes of a song being written after years of silence. He moved with practiced hands, as though he'd never stopped being a veterinarian. He warmed water in the kitchen, added salt, just enough to soothe joints. He wrapped her legs in cloth, cleaned off the mud, trimmed the clumps of frozen fur. Every motion was slow, careful, and wordless, as if his actions spoke for him. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you. Not this time." Then her eyes opened again. Branwin looked at him. No fear. No flinch. Not the way wild animals usually react. Her gaze simply held his. Quietly, deeply. As if she had known him from somewhere long, long ago. It was peace. It was trust. Without a single reason. In that moment, Elias understood. Some invisible thread had just been woven between them. Between man and horse. Between soul and soul. As he was gently drying the fur along her belly, Elias saw it again. This time not in the dim haze of the night, but in the full light of morning. The scar. A spiral. Fine as a hair, curled perfectly around her left hind leg. No swelling. No redness. But unmistakably not natural. It wasn't crooked. It wasn't clumsy. It was as if someone had drawn it, with intention, with care. A mark. Elias froze. He had seen something like this before. Not in real life, but in an old book, buried deep in the veterinary library back in college. A handwritten journal by a northern doctor who once studied an ancient breed known as the guardian line. According to legend, guardian horses weren't just horses. They were born once every generation, each bearing a spiral scar. A birthmark said to signify their role as protectors. It was said they were the soul of the wild, spirits of the forests and lands untouched by man. And whoever found one would carry a piece of that land's destiny. Elias had once scoffed at the story. From a scientific perspective, it was nonsense. But now, Branwin's gaze. That scar. He wasn't so sure anymore. He stood up and opened an old wooden chest. Buried under vaccination records, livestock journals, and medical notes. He found it. A leather-bound notebook, its title long faded, only fragments of the words remained. Of the marked ones. Page 37. A hand-drawn spiral. Exactly like the one on Branwin's leg. Beneath it, in delicate cursive, was written, "The Spiral of Guardians. Born once in a generation. Where the mark lies, so too lies the land's breath. The one who finds becomes the one who keeps." Elias closed the notebook. He placed a hand on the hearth. Not to warm his skin, but to thaw something deeper inside. "Is that what you are?" he asked quietly, eyes on Branwin. "A keeper of something more than just life?" Branwin blinked. Her eyes didn't answer. But deep within them, Elias felt something. Something he couldn't quite name. Something ancient. Something calling. By nightfall, the snow outside had begun to melt. The moon was thin, like a shard of mirror floating through the dark sky. Its pale light spilled onto the cabin window, casting soft reflections that made the room glow like a fairy tale carved from wood and firelight. Branwin had lifted her head from the blankets. Still slow, still shaky, but with will. This was no longer reflex. This was a choice to live. Elias brought in more firewood. He didn't speak. Didn't ask. He simply watched. And for the first time in many, many years, he smiled. I used to believe only death could bring true silence. But that night, by the fire, beneath the gaze of a creature marked by legend, I realized some things move beyond understanding, beyond pain. And still, they find their way to us, gently. The next morning, Elias woke early. The snow had begun to melt, and the earth outside his cabin was damp, muddy, and strangely still. No more howling winds. No more gray sky pressing down on the mountains. Just a mirror-like calm. As if something unseen had shifted, not only in the weather, but in his life. Elias was chopping wood near the porch when he heard the distant rhythm of hooves. A slow gait, uneven, unhurried, like someone approaching with intention and no fear. He held his breath and turned. For the first time in 15 years of solitude, Elias saw a stranger. A woman on horseback, weaving through the melting snow beneath the pines. Her long cloak dusted with the color of the road, her hood pulled low over her face. She sat tall and still in the saddle, as if carved from wind and stone. Instinctively, Elias gripped the axe in his hand, but didn't move forward. He simply watched, as if the world had slowed around them. The woman dismounted. She walked toward him. Her eyes deep, dark, not threatening, but knowing. "Are you Elias Grant?" she asked. Her voice was low, steady. Elias nodded and took a step back. And you are? She pulled back her hood, revealing sun-worn skin, tangled hair falling past her shoulders, and a gaze both resolute and ancient. I'm Lyra, she said. The last of the Mark Keepers. And I've come for the horse. Elias froze. For a moment, it felt like she had spoken words that didn't belong to this century. What did you say? The foal in your cabin, Lyra said calmly. She bears the spiral mark. And you woke her. No one sees that scar unless they were meant to. No one saves Branwin unless they carry the burden. Branwin? Elias repeated. Yes. That's her true name. Her old name. The name from the ancient tongue. She stepped closer. Not with aggression, not asking permission, but with the presence of someone who was always meant to arrive. Branwin was still lying inside the cabin. When Elias and Lyra entered, the foal raised her head and let out a soft whinny. Not in fear, but as if she recognized her. Lyra knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on the foal's brow. The motion was as soft as breath, and yet the room fell completely still. The Mark Keepers. Elias finally asked, Who are you? And why are you here? Lyra didn't look up, but her answer came without hesitation. We were the guardians of Ember Hollow, a land tucked between mountain veins, where guardian horses were born. One per generation, each marked. We don't tame them. We don't ride them. We keep them. Because they aren't just horses. They are the memory of the forest, the breath of the land, the last light of a vanishing world. Elias sat heavily on a wooden chair. His thoughts spun. But I just found her in the snow, barely alive. No mother. No herd. Her herd was shattered, Lyra said softly. By destruction. By humans. By forgetting. Branwin rested her head on Lyra's lap. A gesture Elias had never seen in the days since he rescued her. This foal, Lyra whispered. She's the last flame from Ember Hollow. If she dies, the mark fades. And if the mark fades, so does the story. Elias murmured. This can't be real. Lyra turned to him. No anger. No insistence. Only sorrow. You don't have to believe it. But you've already chosen. Even if you don't remember when. Silence fell. The wind brushed against the walls. Inside, there was only the soft, steady sound of Branwin's breathing. At last, Elias asked, What do I do now? Lyra stood and pulled a stone from her coat pocket. Round, smooth, carved with the exact spiral etched into Branwin's leg. Take it, she said. This stone is part of the legacy. If you hold it, you carry the promise of this land. Branwin cannot return on her own, but you can lead her. Elias took the stone in his hand. It was cold, but from deep within, he felt a quiet thrum, like a sleeping heart beginning to stir. I'd spent 15 years running from memory, but that day, memory found me. Not through a dream, not through a nightmare, but in the form of a strange woman and a creature marked by legend. And I knew. I was no longer just a man of the mountain. I was now a keeper of the mark. But is remembering alone enough to keep them with us forever? That morning, Elias woke before dawn. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because he could feel something waiting. Inside the cabin, Branwin stood quietly by the window, her gaze reaching deep into the woods. As if she already belonged somewhere else, even if her body remained here. Lyra was packing a worn canvas satchel. A coat, a dagger, a water flask, and the spiral stone. No one said a word. Until Elias finally asked, "Where are you going?" Lyra didn't stop what she was doing. She just answered softly, "It's not just me. It's us. And Branwin will lead the way." Elias said nothing. He had known the answer before he asked. Still, a part of him clung to the peace that had only just begun to return. To the firelight. To Branwin resting quietly beside him. Lyra sat down and lit a slender stick of incense. The scent was like burning pine and old wood. She stared into the curling smoke that drifted toward the ceiling. Ember Hollow doesn't appear on any maps anymore. It was once the gathering place of sacred blood horses, where the flame of the horse's heart was kept alive. But when men cut down the forests, built fences, and gave new names to old lands, Ember Hollow faded from memory. And with every horse slaughtered, another piece of that memory died. Elias lowered himself into the seat beside her. "Then why Branwin?" Lyra turned toward him. Her eyes, dark as warm ash, never wavered. "Because she is the final piece. The flame bearer. When she returns to where her bloodline began, the gate will open, and the soul flow of earth, of horse, of forest, will awaken again." Elias bowed his head. His chest ached with the weight of it. Branwin, this creature who had pulled him back from the edge of forgetting, was now the very thing he would have to let go. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice tight. "She'll survive the journey?" Lyra nodded. "Not just survive. She will be made whole." That afternoon, Elias quietly packed his belongings. Each time he looked at Branwin, the question returned. "If she leaves, what will remain in me?" A cold cabin. An empty hearth. Another memory written down and slowly faded away. That night, Elias stepped outside. There was no moon. Only a thick purple sky, like it might rain. Branwin approached him slowly. No altar. No calling. She simply came. She pressed her muzzle into his open palm. Warm. Steady. Trusting. As if to say, "If you go, I won't be afraid." Elias said nothing. He ran his hand gently down her back, then turned and went inside, and packed for the road. The next morning, they set out. Branwin walked ahead, needing no lead rope. Lyra followed silently, the spiral stone tucked into her satchel. And Elias? He didn't know if he was heading into the past, or towards something that had no name. All he knew was this. His heart hadn't felt this light since the day he lost his wife and child. I once thought I had survived that terrible storm so I could learn how to forget. But in truth, I survived so I could remember. And so I could lead a soul back to where it truly belonged. Not to keep it for myself, but to fulfill something far greater than any of us. A journey back to the bloodline, where every memory begins to burn bright once again. 3 days after leaving the cabin, Elias and Lyra guided Branwin across the final ridge. A stretch of jagged stone and biting wind. A place where even trees had learned to bend just to survive. They didn't speak much. Lyra always walked just behind Branwin. Elias, he walked beside her, his breath heavy but never complaining. Each step was an act of surrender. Each gust of wind, a quiet reminder. You are stepping into legend. By late afternoon on the third day, as the sun spilled gold across the mountain peaks, they reached a high ledge, and Elias had to stop to catch his breath. He looked up, and then he saw it. A valley opened below them, deep and wide, wrapped in pine trees and ghostly fog. No houses, No paths. Only gentle movement through the mist, like shadows flowing across the earth. Branwin let out a soft whinny. It was quiet, no louder than wind brushing across a meadow. And in the silence that followed, 5, 6, then dozens of eyes flickered in the fog. The herd had been waiting. For how long, Elias didn't know. He only knew that when he stepped into the valley, none of them ran. No hooves thundered away. No fear, no alarm. Only breath. And presence. They stood there, one by one, unmoving. Eyes wide, still. Their forms noble, shaped like storms and snow and time itself. And then, he stepped forward. The black stallion. Taller than the rest. His coat gleamed like the night sky before a storm. His eyes were ancient bronze, not fierce, but kind and quiet, as if he had lived 1,000 years and remembered them all. He walked toward Elias. Not cautious. Not dominant. Just certain. And then, in a moment that took Elias's breath away, the great stallion bowed his head. Not in submission, but as a greeting. As recognition. As if Elias was no longer a stranger, but the one chosen to return Branwin to where she belonged. Elias didn't touch him. He simply stood still, in reverent silence. Branwin approached from behind. She didn't run. She wasn't afraid. She simply walked. Past Elias. And into the herd. No one stopped her. No one called her back. A moment later, she paused. Turned. Looked back at him. Elias met her gaze. One he would never forget. No tears. No words. Just eyes that said, "Thank you. And I will always remember." Elias couldn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply placed his hand over his heart, where it still beat, and felt. Lyra stood not far away, quiet. She said nothing, only placed her hand upon the spiral stone, and from it, a small light pulsed, then faded. The gate had opened, and Ember Hollow was alive again. That night, Elias sat alone by a quiet stream in the valley. No fire. No shelter. Just a man, once lost, now sitting in the middle of a legend he had once refused to believe. On the howling heights, he was no longer a mountain recluse. No longer a man living among ashes. He was part of something sacred. I once lived only to endure. But now I understand, I was meant to live to witness. To witness eyes that speak gratitude without words. And to witness the flame of memory passed on, without needing to be held, or clung to. And if a soul can return to where it truly belongs, then that is the greatest healing. For it, and for me. But then, when everything has returned to where it's meant to be, who is left to hold us in place? The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of water trickling through the valley, and the faint scent of pine resin drifting on the breeze. Branwin was no longer beside him, as she had been on previous nights. She had returned to the herd. And Elias was now truly alone. Lyra did not reappear. All she left behind was the spiral stone, resting on a large flat rock beside a dry laurel branch. No letter. No farewell. Just one quiet sign. From here on, this journey is yours alone. Elias picked up the stone. It was still warm. Perhaps from someone's hand. Or maybe from a memory now living in his own. He walked toward the edge of the valley, where the red earth shifted into deeper hues, and the trees bore strange, ancient carvings. Beneath his foot, something soft, Ash. He knelt and scooped a handful of gray-black dust, fine as time itself. And then, in the first breeze of morning, the ash rose upward. It didn't fall. It didn't disappear. It spiraled like smoke, then shimmered into the shape of a small horse before vanishing into the air. Elias held his breath. He had once dismissed signs like these. Science couldn't explain them. Reason would call it illusion. But his heart, no longer wounded, knew this was a calling. The rest of the day, Elias wandered through the valley. He wasn't looking for anything, but with each step, he discovered more than he ever expected. A fossilized hoofprint, ancient and perfect. A stone wall etched with a spiral nearly identical to Branwin's. A shallow cave with the handprint of a child, so small, so distant in time. It felt like touching the breath of the past. By midday, he paused beneath a great pine tree. He placed a spiral stone in his palm and whispered, "I brought her home. I did my part. But what about me? Where do I go, if not back to the cabin?" No voice replied. But the stone warmed again. Not brightly. Just enough to tell him, there's still a path forward. That evening, Elias sat alone at the heart of the awakened valley. The herd lingered in the distance. Not approaching, not running. Just watching. And Branwin stood at the edge of the herd, watching him. Not like the day they parted, but as if she was waiting to see if, this time, he would choose for himself. He thought of May, his wife, of his son, who once called him the father with warm hands, of that terrible night. But for the first time, as the memories came, they didn't ache. They simply lingered. Gentle, like moonlight slipping through treetops. Elias smiled. "Not all endings are losses," he murmured. "Some endings are beginnings." He stood up, brought nothing with him, only the stone, and began walking toward the southern end of the valley, where the mist thinned, and sunlight kissed the lichen-covered stones. He didn't know where the path led. He didn't need to. He only knew. It was time to live, not just survive. I came here to guide a soul home to its ancient bloodline. But it turns out, I was the one being led back. Not to the place I once lived, but to the part of myself I left behind 15 years ago. Asterisk. And now, I won't go back to the cabin. I'll go wherever the wind calls. Because for the first time, I understand, asterisk. To live is to choose. And I've chosen myself. Elias kept walking south. Through stone creeks, through mist-covered woods. Through silent plains where only the wind carried the sound of wing beats. No map. No destination. Just a collection of quiet signs. A butterfly out of season, a single flower blooming in the wind. And the constant, gentle warmth of the spiral stone against his hip. On the 6th day, he reached a shallow basin, where the late afternoon sunlight draped the land like an old wool blanket. There, in the heart of the valley, stood a stone shelter, covered in lichen, barely holding its shape. No one lived there, but Elias remembered it. He approached slowly, hand instinctively resting over his heart. It was here, this place, 19 years ago, before May and Danny were gone, that he had spoken a promise. Back when he was a young vet, Elias had come here to care for an old, dying horse. The horse didn't make it, but Elias had stayed through the night, through the wind, through the cold. And as his fire dwindled to embers, he had whispered, "One day, when I can no longer heal what's on the outside, I'll return here to begin healing what's inside. He had never come back. Until now. The sky darkened to violet. Elias lit a fire, not for warmth, but to keep his promise. The flames burned low and steady. They didn't rage. They didn't fade. Just like him, finally learning how to keep a fire without needing someone else to tend it. That night, Elias sat beside the fire and wrote the old promise again. This time, in charcoal, on the stone wall. I came back. And this time, I'm not leaving. Just before dawn, something unexpected happened. A young horse, thin, gray, and trembling, emerged from the tree line. It wasn't Branwin. It wasn't from Ember Hollow. It was just a small, lost creature. Nervous, wide-eyed, unsure. Elias didn't move. He simply held out his hand and waited. The foal hesitated, then stepped closer and gently pressed its head into his palm. He smiled, not surprised, just whispered, "So it begins again." But this time, it didn't begin from loss. It began from readiness. The readiness to give, without fearing the cost. The next morning, Elias rebuilt the old stone shelter. It wasn't big. It wasn't pretty. But it was warm. He placed a spiral stone on the center of a small wooden table, right at the heart. This would be the place where the flame never dies. Not for anyone else, but because, at last, he had chosen to stay. I didn't return to my old cabin. I didn't leave the mountains. I returned to a promise. One I had forgotten I ever made. Asterisk. And as the fire rose, no one needed to see it. Only I needed to remember. That light, that warmth, was mine. And I became its keeper. Not for others, but for myself. The next spring, the rains came earlier than usual. Elias's little stone shelter still stood, weathered, quiet, simple. Nestled deep within a silent valley where the trees had begun to green again. And birds remembered the way home. He no longer counted the days. He no longer lit fires because of the cold, but because of something else. Memory. He remembered himself. He remembered the journey. And sometimes, he remembered Branwin, even if he had never spoken her name aloud. One drizzly afternoon, as Elias was boiling tea over the hearth, he heard footsteps on the wet earth outside. He turned, not surprised, just nodded gently. A young girl, maybe 12, stood at the doorway. Hair tangled, clothes streaked with mud, clutching an old torn backpack to her chest. She said nothing, just looked. Elias stood, poured a second cup of tea, and set it on the chair across from his. No questions, no pressure. And the girl sat down. Half an hour passed in silence. Only the sound of rain, the soft crackle of the fire, and the quiet steam rising from Elias's tea, fogging his glasses. Then, the girl spoke. "I'm lost." Elias nodded. "What are you trying to find?" She stayed quiet. Then whispered, "I don't know. I just kept walking. I felt tired. And cold." Elias nodded again. "Then you found the right place." That evening, Elias brought out an extra blanket, shared his food, and placed a spiral stone in the center of the table. The girl stared at the stone for a long time. Her eyes shimmered, not with curiosity, but with the sense that she recognized something in it. Before bed, she asked, "Who are you?" Elias smiled. "I'm the one who keeps the fire." The next morning, when the girl woke, Elias was already outside, cutting grass, preparing water, stirring porridge. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then quietly joined him, kneeling beside the fire. No more questions. No need for the past. Just the present, warm enough, and shared with someone by the embers. We cannot keep everyone with us forever, but if we can tend even a single flame, gently and faithfully, then one day, someone lost may find their way home by its light. And maybe, just maybe, the meaning of life isn't to go far, but to know when to stop and light a small fire. One that doesn't need to be seen by all, only to be ready for the next soul who comes looking. All of us carry a cabin inside, a quiet space where we hide after loss, heartbreak, or the things we never speak of. We believe staying inside keeps us safe. But sometimes, it only takes a soft whinny, a soul that needs us, or just one quiet, grateful glance to awaken something within that's been sleeping far too long. Branwin wasn't just a horse. She was memory. She was an unspoken promise. She was the part of us that still dares to fight to become whole again. Elias didn't save Branwin. The truth is, Branwin saved Elias. She awakened him. And in the end, he chose to live. Not for anyone else, but for himself. Here's the lesson. We can't hold on to everyone forever. But if we can keep just one thing, something small and steady, like a quiet flame inside our heart, then someday, someone, lost and cold, might find their way back by the light we've kept burning. Living doesn't need to be grand. You don't need to be remembered by name. You just need to know how to keep the fire. Keep it for yourself, and quietly pass it on. He didn't return to his old cabin. He didn't leave the mountains. He returned to a promise, one he had forgotten he ever made. And as the fire flickered gently inside that quiet stone shelter, no one needed to see it. Because now, Elias understood that light didn't need to shine for the world. It only needed to burn bright enough for a lost soul to find its way home. Branwin was returned to where she truly belonged. But the one who truly came home was Elias. Back to himself. Back to memory. Back to life. If you've ever felt lost, broken, or alone, remember this. You only need to keep one flame burning. Even a small one, unseen by others, can guide someone else out of the dark. And maybe that someone is you. Awakened not by grand triumphs, but by the quiet gift of choosing to live again.